Hello, if you're watching this, it's probably because you've just started studying and in spectacles for GCSE English Literature. The play starts with these stage directions in which J.B. Priestley tells us when and where the play is set. And this is what he says: all three acts, which are continuous, take place in the dining room of the Burlings house in Brumley, an industrial city in the North Midlands. It is an evening in spring 1912. Act 1. The dining room is of a fairly large suburban house belonging to a prosperous manufacturer. It has a good solid furniture of the period. The general effect is a substantial and heavily comfortable, but not cosy and homelike. First of all then, let's have a look at where Priestley wants the play to be set. Remember, this play was first performed in 1945, so it's a period piece. That means it's set in the author's past, in this case 1912. Okay, well, in English history, when was 1912? Well, it was part of what historians call the Edwardian era, this period from 1901, upon the death of Queen Victoria, through to 1914, the beginning of the First World War. That's King Edward VII there, that's why it's called the Edwardian era. He reigned from 1901 until 1910, in which he died. And I know what you're thinking. How can 1912 be called Edwardian if Edward died in 1910? And the reason is one of convenience. The real beginning and the end of the period in historical terms is the death of Queen Victoria, the turn of the 20th century, and then the beginning of the war. Okay, so what was life like in Britain in 1912 or in the Edwardian period? Well, British empire and colonialism was at its height. The British had the biggest empire in the world, and so this is a time in which Britain was its most powerful, and it kept that empire by having an extremely strong army and an extremely strong navy. It was a very militaristic society. Every town would have had a drill hall and a parade square. Those buildings still stand in many towns now, although they've been repurposed, and it would be a place where people would be, young men would be recruited for the army, recruited for the navy, and they'd be marched up and down the square and trained. Britain was also a very patriotic society. People believed that the British ruled the world because they were the best racially and socially. They were the best. They were the superior race, and it was their mission to sail around the world, civilizing the rest of the world with British values. As well as being at the height of its imperial and military power, Britain was at the height of its industrial power, and it led the world in industrial production. Towns and cities had swollen over the previous 100 years to an enormous size, and there were new mills, new factories in every town and city in the land, many of which still exist today. And these were driven by the burning of coal, which drove steam engines, which drove the machinery in the factories and in the mills. And these huge factories, these huge mills, produced vast amounts of goods to make Britain rich and make the owners of the factories rich, and they employed vast numbers of people, usually on low pay and in dangerous and unhealthy conditions. Britain led the world in its science and technology, and all over Europe actually, and in America. Vast ocean liners were being built. The Americans were finally working out how to make people fly in powered airplanes. The motor car was invented, and all of these things were good for business. It meant people and goods could travel further than ever before. Electricity was becoming a thing in people's homes, and on a more theoretical level, the mathematics required for the atomic age, which was coming in the 1940s, that mathematics was being done in universities across Europe at that time. And so in many ways, the Edwardian era was the start of modern Britain, really. Why does all this matter? Well, it matters because Britons were very, very confident of their place in the world. They were here to stay. God had blessed them with superior genes and a superior civilization, and they were realizing their country's destiny to rule the world through military power, through industrial power, through science and technology. And so it was very easy for patriotic Britons to say, we are here to stay, we rule the world, we are the best. And this huge sense of confidence was everywhere in Edwardian England. The flip side of all this power and wealth was that there was huge poverty and inequality. Those factories were owned by individual men, and they were worked in by a vast army of workers who would have lived in cramped and overcrowded housing, which was full of disease, hunger, malnutrition, and all of those problems of poverty which you would expect from living in those conditions. Just because most Britons were very patriotic and very hopeful and very confident about Britain's place in the world, that doesn't mean that there wasn't dissent. Women, for example, were starting to realise that Britain was an unjust society because it was patriarchal. You remember that word from last year. It was patriarchal. It was ruled by men. Women, for example, were not allowed to vote. And so women started campaigning for the vote. The movement known as the suffragette movement was founded in this time. Also, conditions in the cities and in the factories led to pressure for social change. So old age pensions were brought in at this time. So when you were no longer able to work on a farm or in a factory or as a soldier, you weren't left destitute. You know, you had a pension, as well as a minimum wage was brought in to try and alleviate the terrible poverty. And so just because Edwardian England was an unequal place, it doesn't mean that it wasn't changing. Okay, so we've seen that the play is set in 1912 in this time of huge power and huge patriotism and huge confidence about Britain and its place in the world, but also a time of dissent, a time of change, and a time of inequality. Let's have a look then at where the play is set. Well, it's set in an industrial city in the North Midlands called Brumley. Brumley is fictional, there is no such town, but you may know that Brum is an old-fashioned and has now become a sort of slang term, a nickname for the city of Birmingham, which is indeed in the Midlands and was an industrial city. And so when J.B. Priestley says Brumley, he's referring to somewhere like Birmingham very, very consciously. Okay, so what was Edwardian Birmingham like? Well, it was enormous. It was an industrial city. It was full of mills and factories, and that meant that it was very dirty. There were chimney stacks everywhere, belching out coal smoke in order to drive those machines in those factories. There was inequality. There were great civic buildings, like which still exist, like the town hall there. But most people lived in overcrowded conditions in terraced houses, some of which still exist in all towns and cities. You know, you'll see these small terraced houses which have been improved over the years. If you look at those bottom pictures there, you'll see that these houses had no sanitation, no plumbing, they had no indoor toilet, and they were overcrowded and small. So you might think, okay, well, is the play then set in one of these crowded, small workers' terraces? Well, no. We find out that the play is set in a fairly large suburban house belonging to a prosperous manufacturer. So that tells us then that this play isn't about the people who work in the factories of Brumley or Birmingham. It's about the man who owns it, a prosperous manufacturer, a man who manufactures things. Prosperous means rich, so a rich man who owns a factory. We're in his house, and it's a fairly large suburban house. So when we think of fairly large suburban house, that's very subjective. It means a different thing to everybody. And so these are all suburban houses, and whether you think they're large or not will probably depend on your background. There are three suburban houses. To my mind, they're probably too small for a man like Burling. Burling will probably have had a bigger house than that. He's richer than that. So here we go. Here are three more suburban houses, more of the type that Burling may have built, because these are all Edwardian houses. These were all built by industrialists to live in. Now, note suburban rather than countryside. Suburban means outside the town. Burling is a prosperous manufacturer. He's made his money in owning factories. And so he may need to live near the factories. He doesn't want to live in the middle of town because of the overcrowding and the poverty and the crime and the disease. He doesn't want to live where his workers live, but he needs to be close to the factory. So he lives a few miles outside the town or the city, and he's built himself a house, probably like one of these. It's very important to note that Burling does not live in a house like that. He does not live in a country house, because country houses belong to the aristocracy, the gentry, people who didn't earn their money through owning factories. They didn't earn their money at all. They inherited it. Burling desperately wants to be a member of this class of country gentry, country aristocracy. However, he is not. His house is a suburban house, not a big country house. That distinction will become clear in the next video when we start talking about class. A good solid furniture of the period. We are in the dining room of the Burling house. So let's have a look at what a good solid furniture of the period means. Here's a couple of examples of an Edwardian dining room. It might seem quite stuffy and quite overcrowded in the rooms. There's a lot of furniture in there. It was just the fashion of the day to have good quality hardwood furniture. Hardwood, tropical hardwood, was a benefit that came from the empire. We owned parts of Africa where hardwood trees could be felled and turned into expensive furniture for wealthy people. And so a big dining table or a big sideboard or a piano with ivory keys was considered a status symbol. You showed your wealth and your taste through your furniture. And this is what Burling does, because you'll notice the general effect is substantial and heavily comfortable, but not cozy and home-like. Now, your parents probably try to make your house welcoming for visitors and cozy and comfortable, but that isn't what we get here with the Burling house. And so if he hasn't decorated his house in order to make it cozy and comfortable, well, why has he use this good solid furniture? Well, perhaps he's trying to show his status. Look at me, look at my expensive furniture. I'm a very important man. Maybe he wants to show his wealth. Look what I can afford. Maybe he wants to show his strength and his power. And maybe he wants to show through this substantial furniture that the English upper class, that the British Empire, the British manufacturing empire is here to stay. It's going to endure. Now, here's the problem when you try to show off your importance, your wealth, your power, and your legacy, is that you end up coming across as a little bit insecure, and that's what Burling's like. And so sometimes if we try too hard to show how important we are, we come across as insecure. If we try to show how rich we are, we're in danger of coming across as vulgar. That means tasteless and tacky. It's vulgar, impolite to show off how rich you are. And when somebody tries too hard to show you how powerful they are, perhaps that comes across as a bit of a facade, a bit fake. Maybe he's trying too hard to try and show how powerful he is. And by having this large suburban house and this substantial furniture, perhaps Burling is trying to show how established and how permanent he and his class are. But we, the audience, know that the First World War is going to blow away their certainties. It's going to take away from them their sons and their wealth. And so maybe there's some hubris, there's some overconfidence in the furniture in this room. Okay, I hope you found this video interesting and useful, and thanks for watching.